Stellar Blade, new action game from developer Shift Up, published by Sony as a second-party PlayStation 5 console exclusive. Shift Up's first foray into AAA game development. Does it stand up to some of the best AAA games in terms of quality? The short answer, yes and no. In a few aspects, it's an excellent game, but it stumbles hard in many others. However, I was genuinely surprised by the makeup of this game and believe it's a great start for Shift Up in the AAA space. Stellar Blade is a game that excels in its combat, where every other part of the game doesn't really approach the standard that the combat sets. The game has a number of linear levels, interspersed with 2 open-world areas to break this up and allow the game some room to breathe. However, it starts with a very long linear level in Idaho 7 that goes on for about 4 hours and does not let you leave. The game really got me with this because the demo ended after the first boss, Abaddon, and I assumed that would be the end of the first level, but no, it is not, and the rest of this level actually has 2 more boss fights and a myriad of explorable areas, even some that are locked off till later. It really ends up setting the tone for future linear levels, because they are all equally lengthy and deep as this first one. This is definitely something to note, however. This game starts slowly and takes many hours to pick up. Encounters are largely easy, and even the bosses aren't a huge challenge. Eve does not have a lot of tools at this point in the game, and the developers definitely took that into account. Once you complete the first level, you're introduced to the main hub city, Zion, after which the game does open up a lot. Many NPCs give side quests, and there is a bulletin board for more basic tasks. Exploring Zion itself does have a lot of value as well, because there are a lot of collectibles littered throughout if you want to learn more about the people of Zion and what the situation is there. It's also just not an overwhelming amount of content. If you focus on exploring the wasteland and doing the side quests before the next couple linear missions, it will only take you a few hours total. And as someone coming fresh off Unicorn Overlord and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, let me tell you, this was a complete breath of fresh air for me. Stellar Blade certainly respects your time, and I appreciate the game for that. It's funny, looking back at the game as a whole, there are really only 5 total linear levels, plus 1 optional one for the secret ending, and these are where the meat of the game is. There are 2 shooter levels, where your sword is not available. I'll get to these in a bit, and the rest are normal levels like Idaho 7, where you follow a linear path. These 3 to 4 normal levels are the best part of the game. They're tight, well-designed, and where most of the game's interesting gameplay comes from. These levels, while linear, have multiple side paths to explore, with a ton of collectibles, chests, and character upgrades if you fully explore them, with multiple boss fights to break them up into chunks. To be honest, if the whole game were just a few more of these with no open world, I might honestly like the game more. This is where the quality in the game is, and it does make me wonder if the open world spaces really need to be there. Unfortunately, it's not all sunshine and roses for these linear levels. The 2 shooter levels I referenced earlier are easily the worst part of the game, and I frankly hope in a sequel there is no thought to include levels like these again. Disabling the entirety of Eve's kit to shoehorn in a couple levels that force you to use the drone gun feels like a gimmick. These levels are a slog, full of the same 3 to 4 enemies endlessly. The encounters are boring and repetitive, to the point that I think the developers felt the same way, because these 2 sections of the game are absolutely jam-packed with ambush-type encounter design.
You're gonna have to move. Eve, watch out!
This gets so bad in the second one that you'll clear a room, go interact with the objective, and then turn around and an enemy has magically spawned where you just were to ambush you. Enemies fall from the ceiling in nearly every room, making you wonder how or why they're all up there. Some falling in rooms where it doesn't even make sense because the ceiling is so insanely high. They both even culminate with basically the same exact boss fight. Encounters boil down to 3 types in these levels. An ambush, a bunch of enemies running at you down a hallway or across a room in a straight line, and kill rooms where you're stuck in a room with rotating one-hit kill lasers while you have to kill a group of enemies in an enclosed space. There's very little skill or tactics required to beat these encounters, and if there are more of these in the next game, I hope they make the encounters a little bit more interesting. The ambush issues aren't just restricted to these 2 levels, however. It happens in both the first 2 other major linear levels quite a bit, to the point that it becomes this obvious crutch to keep players on their toes. It was frustrating because when the game laid out encounters in an honest way, it's actually really fun to figure out how you will tactically approach the fight. It's also strange because this encounter design almost completely disappears in the final large level of the game. I do hope in a sequel that they tone this down. It was very obnoxious at a certain point and does not make the game more challenging. I've keyed on this so much because the game is truly not excessively challenging, and the ambush-heavy encounters stand out as a result. While the game certainly presents as a Sekiro-inspired game with its parry system, it's really more between that and a traditional character action game like Bayonetta or Devil May Cry. The perfect parry and dodge windows are very short, and while there are ways to make this easier with equipment or through the skill tree, it never gets to a point where it's easy to pull off consistently. This is because this game seems to be one where actions are animation-based rather than trigger-based, meaning that Eve's animations have to play fully when a button is pressed. You're not fully able to cancel out of animations, especially when you're deeper into combos. Despite this, enemy damage is not that high, and as you level Eve up, her power curve tends to curtail any issues of heightened enemy difficulty. I will say, I did notice a significant uptick in enemy health and damage later in the game, but by that point, you have so many tools at your disposal that you can survive a lot of punishment. The game gives you a lot of tools. You can execute several 4 to 5 button combos right from the beginning of the game with a couple small beta skills. Throughout the game, you can unlock more beta skills, and you get access to a secondary type of skill called burst skills, then finally unlock a super mode where you're briefly invulnerable and get a new skill set. This is in addition to the shooting mechanics with the drone, combat items, and some layered mechanics built into the skill tree. The combat gets very complicated by the end, and combining all of these things together becomes very enjoyable. This ultimately puts Stellar Blade in its own niche within the action game genre. It's got bits and pieces from many other games, but labeling it as Souls-like is doing the game a disservice. It has its own style, and players should explore that style without preconceived notions that it plays like Sekiro or a character action game. I say this because this label of Souls-like has become a very common way to describe this game, and it's entirely inaccurate. I've heard many people become turned off because they think it's difficult like a Souls game. Let me just dispel this now. This game is not difficult the way Sekiro or other Souls games are, and even has an easy mode if you are worried about normal being too hard. Anyone can beat Stellar Blade. One issue I did encounter a lot was the timing of attacks. Many enemies have very purposely delayed attacks to make it difficult to successfully parry. Many action games use this approach to make combat more difficult, but this is one area I'm personally not a fan of. Enemies holding their attacks an extra beat to throw your timing off. It's just a cheap way to throw players off, especially when you cannot punish these enemies for the delayed attacks. It's not a deal breaker by any stretch. You eventually memorize these patterns, but it's something I do hope Shift Up does less of in future games. Bosses in Stellar Blade are largely excellent. Varied in their designs and combat styles, nearly every boss is a fun fight. Some are certainly tougher than others, but the difficulty of these will come down to how your individual playstyle matches up against each boss. Overall, they're not that difficult, and the power curve of Eve I mentioned earlier tends to eclipse boss difficulty throughout the game. It's interesting, though, that a few bosses get a rematch during some of the side quests, and many of these rematch bosses get some new moves that they didn't have the first time around. It's noteworthy that they held this power back for optional side content, and ended up demonstrating that challenge wasn't their primary goal with the boss fights throughout the game, especially the early ones. There is a ramp up in boss difficulty toward the end of the game, especially the last 2 to 3 bosses. I will say the secret ending boss is probably the only one that might prove to be a wall for some players. Overall, this is fine though. By this point in the game, you have access to Eve's entire kit, and the majority of the skill tree is unlocked. I personally like that the game tries to give players higher difficulty fights late in the game. There are 2 open world areas in the game, and I vastly prefer one to the other. The first one, the Wasteland, is the one I enjoyed of the 2. It has many distinct spaces you go to, and those branch into different paths. Those areas are fairly small and easy to explore. Some take you down linear paths to an endpoint, and most parts of the map have some side quest or notice board task objective present. This means you naturally explore most of the map by just doing the side quests you have, and I found this design to feel good. If you're thorough and don't just run straight to your objective, you can find a lot hidden in both open world areas. The Wasteland overall was a lot of fun to run through. The second area, on the other hand, was not nearly as enjoyable. It has a fully open map with no barriers or pits between the different sections, and unfortunately, it's not nearly as fun to run through. There's an exclusive enemy type in this area called lurkers who attack you from underground, and they're not visible with the scanner. While you can see where they are by observing the sand, unfortunately, they're so prevalent in this area that it's difficult to traverse large distances quickly. There's also a large ruined city in this area that is probably my least favorite area in the entire game. I was trying to do some quest objectives in this area, and the one I was doing happened to be on top of a tall building. I had to go climb up a nearby building and then platform across a few other buildings in order to reach it. The thing is, I died a couple times trying to get to the objective. And I hadn't found the one camp inside this city yet, so I had to travel all the way back from a camp way outside of it, fighting or running past all the enemies to get there. I ended up dying a second time because they decided to put a one-hit kill laser in front of a chest along the path to the objective. Of course, I tried to get it. Silly me. I should have ignored it, but ended up dying. Okay, so I decided to go around the other side of the city to get back to where I was, because maybe it would be easier. But I was met with doors I couldn't open from the outside, then random quicksand traps that instantly kill you. It ended up taking me over an hour to get to the quest objective, and it just generally sucked ass. This area has a bunch of these quicksand traps that are hard to see, and you can't get out of them once you are in them. It's another reason you can't just run across the map in this area. They made it very frustrating in a game where combat should be the main difficulty challenge. This was the moment in the game where I started to think these open world areas were a dangerous idea and could kind of take away from the game. Regardless of my feelings on each individual map, they're both very densely packed. There are many collectibles to find, along with power-ups and chests if you explore thoroughly. I hope Shift Up really considers with the next game if they want to continue with this split level design, because their linear levels really shine and these open world ones just don't. I think it would have been better to focus on the Wasteland as the one open world area, make it a bit more dense, and scrap the desert entirely. Then maybe give us one more big linear level like Matrix 11 or Eidos 7. I would have loved another level like those instead of the desert. I did go back and look at trailers after I beat the game, and it's interesting that if you go look at the one from September 9th, 2021, that they don't show a single shot of either open world area, either shooter level, or Zion. This indicates to me that all these aspects of the game were added later in development, possibly after Sony got involved, because they do show clips from all 3 major linear levels, which largely went unchanged in the final release. It's just interesting to note, because while I do think these parts of the game aren't poorly made, they should have continued to focus on adding more linear levels rather than these pieces that distract from the core gameplay loop. Moving on to the story, it's serviceable enough. It wants to be near very badly, but it doesn't get anywhere near those lofty heights. Eve's a decent protagonist, but most of the other characters outside maybe Lily don't really shine. This is bogged down by the voice acting. Unfortunately, outside of Lily, maybe Eve, and one other late game villain, the voice acting overall is not great in English. Adam in particular stands out for wooden delivery and very little emotion. Maybe they wanted this robotic delivery, but even if they did, the dialogue also doesn't really stand up. The narrative overall is fairly predictable throughout too. If you do side activities, gather collectibles, and actually read them, many of the major plot reveals are heavily telegraphed well before they happen in the main plot. I will say, very late in the game, things get more interesting, even resulting in a major story decision the player gets to make. This decision leads to very different endings, which is cool, but the secret ending is definitely not earned by what happens in the main narrative. I honestly was starting to like Eve and Lily by the end of the game, but the secret ending is just so bad that it kind of ruins these characters for me. I can't say more without getting into spoilers, so I'm going to leave my thoughts on the story there. The soundtrack in Stellar Blade, it's absolutely excellent. A large part of the soundtrack was created by Nier Automata composer Keiichi Okabe's production company, so it's no surprise that it echoes Nier in a lot of its music design. However, most of the soundtrack was created in-house at Shift Up, and this is an extremely impressive accomplishment as their first AAA game. I literally obsessed over the Ido 7 track for a week or two after playing the demo, but I was kind of concerned that the quality wouldn't carry over to the rest of the soundtrack. But boy, was I wrong. This game is chock full of great tracks. I will be adding many of these to my music rotation. There were a ton of moments where I was humming along with the music, and most areas in the game have unique tracks. Even boss music is not repeated often, with many metal/rock tracks that enhance the action on screen. The game also has dynamic music, where the track playing will ramp up a bit during combat into a different form. And I love this usage of music in games, and I hope it becomes more prevalent. Eve also has many costumes you can unlock throughout the game. Yes, they're provocative, but there are also plenty where Eve's is covered up if you aren't into that sort of thing. You can also change Eve's earrings, glasses, or hair, and properly play dress up if you're into that. I ended up finding an outfit that I liked early and just stuck with that for most of the game, but there are a ton of options if you want to change things up. This aspect of the game has turned into a bit of a controversy because Shift Up made some modifications to many outfits that make them less revealing. I'll just say that I don't personally care either way on this, but Eve's look is completely incongruent with what is happening in the game. I find having her in a skimpy outfit to be very distracting with what you're doing in the game, as well as the way people act. This is a world where fashion basically doesn't exist, and the people barely even know what the concept of love is. It's there for fan service, and that's fine, but complaining that her clothes aren't more revealing than they already are, it's the type of thing that people stereotype gamers for. So basically, let's all calm down. This isn't that serious of an issue. You're still able to make Eve look plenty sexy. I mean, like, look at this side boob. Look at it. You call this shit censored? All right, so I mentioned Nier a couple times so far, and I do want to talk about Stellar Blade's relationship to it. It's no secret that Nier Automata is a huge inspiration for this game, and many aspects of this game edge very closely to things that Nier did. This includes music, character design, narrative design, and even gameplay to some degree. While all this is true and it can be ever present if you really focus on it, I didn't personally find it to be distracting enough to detract from the experience. These things are different enough to be homages, but still have their own characteristics that make them unique to Stellar Blade. However, I do think everyone is going to feel differently on this point, and is definitely one to keep in mind if you've played Nier Automata. But overall, I think it's a disservice to this game to call it a ripoff of Nier and leave the analysis there. While that is the obvious inspiration for this game, I do think it branches away from that inspiration into its own gameplay systems, level design, and even musical ideas. Overall, Stellar Blade's a great game that I recommend. It stumbles in many areas outside of combat, but the combat is so good that it largely makes those things minor inconveniences. I do wish that the game was more focused on the things that it does well, such as combat and linear level design. Also hope with the next game that the full kit the player has access to is given earlier in the game's playtime. You don't really get full access to Eve's kit until before the point of no return in the game, and that's crazy for a game that is 20 to 30 hours. The narrative doesn't end up fully sticking the landing either, but it is an interesting world, and I would like to see another game in it. Hopefully Shift Up's next game will solve some of these problems and double down on the great combat and linear level design they established here. And that's it. Those are my thoughts on Stellar Blade. Thanks for watching, everybody. This was my first attempt at video content like this, and the process ended up being a lot of fun. Let me know your thoughts on Stellar Blade in the comments below. And please like the video, subscribe to our channel if you'd like to see more videos like this. And if you enjoyed this review and like to hear more of my thoughts on games and the industry at large, then check out my weekly podcast, The Player's Take, that I do with my co-host, Montreal Rice. See you guys on the next one.